Thanks so much, Leanne. And as indicated previously, Solidarity, of course, challenged the state of disaster on the basis that it was irrational and unnecessary. Solidarity says that it has received a legal letter from the State Attorney's Office requesting that it withdraws its court application to have the state of disaster scrapped. Now, the head of Solidarity's Research Institute, Connie Mulder, joins us now via Zoom to discuss this matter. Connie, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning.
There you are. Thanks so much. So, Connie, it would appear that government now has backtracked on its initial decision. I just spoke to the Deputy Minister, Park Stow, and he basically says that they are now satisfied that the conditions that existed and necessitated that state of disaster about a month ago are no longer in place. What's your view on what's been happening here?
Well, I think government was assisted in this decision by the looming court action, which we would have met with the judge on Tuesday after the Easter weekend. And all indications are that they stood no chance at all. And that is why suddenly on this arbitrary date, government decides to withdraw the state of disaster. The exact same thing happened with the coronavirus state of disaster. Our court date was looming, and a day or two before that, government suddenly realized it's no longer necessary. So this is not at all of their own volition. This is pressure, and it's an implicit admission. And I think that is what makes us the most angry. It's an implicit admission that it was never necessary, that the state of disaster was all political theatre, that all the legislative instruments that government needs to get out of this crisis has not only been in their hands since February, it's been in their hands for several years, which means we could have had action on load shedding within the existing framework 5 years ago or 6 years ago. Nothing was done, and once again, that emphasizes our point. We are in load shedding because we want to be here. There's no political will to get out of it.
So I did try to pulse the Deputy Minister on the reasons in terms of what has changed that necessitated that state of disaster to its withdrawal just over a month later, but unfortunately didn't get anywhere on that because he basically has kicked the can down the road. So we're now waiting for the Minister of Electricity to perhaps ask those questions for specifics with regard to what has changed. On your side, though, can you confirm the receipt of that letter from the State Attorney requesting Solidarity to withdraw its court application?
Absolutely. As yesterday morning, we received a letter from the State Attorney stating unequivocally that government was going to gazette with termination of the state of disaster, asking us to please withdraw our court application and then tendering to pay our costs for this court application as well. So all of this implies that it's the court action that forced him into this. The reasons for the withdrawing it is there are no reasons for it to exist in the first place, and I think that is why you've got a lot of ministers that's sort of jumping around like cats on hot tin roofs and not knowing exactly how to spin this. But our position has been from the very start, we're in this crisis because of government mismanagement, and giving a bigger hammer to a bad builder will not lead to a better building, only to more damage, and that is exactly what the state of disaster was. We gave government unfettered power to solve a problem that they created through the abuse of power. And once again, we're reiterating for the government, please, we want you to make it possible for private generation to connect to the grid. If at all, just get out of the way of the private and community sector. Let us solve this problem. The solution to load shedding lies on the roofs of millions of South Africans, not in the single corridors of power in the Union building.
So have you responded to the State Attorney's letter and the request to withdraw your court action?
Yes, that's from what I understand. Our response has been that obviously after the Gazette, it makes no sense to go to court to scrap a state of disaster that has been terminated. But we will obviously be taking the costs order and having government pay our costs. I think we'll still be meeting with the judge, but it will mostly be to just make this settlement agreement an order of the court to ensure that everyone complies.
So perhaps you could assist us with regard to the fact that you say that the state of disaster was never necessary and that whatever legislation was needed already exists and government could have used that in order to effect the sort of changes it needed to make at Eskom to mitigate the load shedding disaster. So talk to us about that and what you mean by that.
Well, for us to get out of this situation, we need additional power generation. It's as simple as that. And the Electricity Regulation Act already empowers the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy to simply gazette that we need 6,000 megawatt or 8,000 megawatt or 10,000 megawatt of emergency power. In fact, Minister Mantashe has done this before in July of 2020. No state of disaster is necessary for that. Exempting hospitals and agriculture can be done by amending NRS 048-9. It's the document that governs who gets load shed and who doesn't. That document is continuously updated. There's no reason to be in a state of disaster for that. Appointing a Minister of Electricity is the President's own prerogative according to the Constitution. We do not need to be in a state of disaster for the President to appoint whatever minister he deems necessary, which means all the legislative instruments we need. Well, the last one would be we need NERSA to start publishing guidelines for feed-in tariffs as well as wheeling tariffs that allows the private sector to know what's it going to cost to transfer electricity on Eskom's grid, but as well as on municipalities' grid. This can be done and has been done in the past. It's part of NERSA's mandate, in fact. It doesn't require a state of disaster. So that's why when we announced a state of disaster, what happened was a government gave itself the absolute powers that it had during the coronavirus crisis with no real reason. With all the legislative instruments that are already in government's hands, they just failed to use them in the past. And what Angus has, as I previously stated, is these legislative instruments have been available for more than 5 years, or at least 10 years. We could have been out of this crisis if, for the proper use of these legislative instruments, a whole long time ago. Yet government insisted on going the political theatre route, looking like they're doing something with a state of disaster, instead of getting on with the business of decentralizing power generation and ensuring that we get private commercial generators as well as private residential generators onto the system and producing electrons as quickly as possible to consumers who want to buy it. Because ultimately, electricity is just a consumer good like cell phone usage, like fiber internet, and we need to enable the market to provide in the needs of South Africa, which it most definitely can. From what we can see, private generation has skyrocketed. NERSA has registered more than 1,000 megawatt of private generation projects in the first 3 months of this year alone, compared with 1,600 megawatt for the whole of 2022. So private generation is coming online. We now need to ensure government does not stand in the way of connecting these private generators to the electricity grid.
So just to conclude, government obviously, if the situation changes again and we're faced with stage 8, possibly stage 10 again, if they decide that the conditions merit that, as per Deputy Minister Tau's response to me, they could institute another state of disaster. And I would imagine, as Solidarity, you would then challenge that again. So, it seems as though, this is a never-ending little cycle. So is there anything that you're hoping to do, maybe to preemptively or also proactively deal with this matter going forward?
I think this legal precedent that is set now with government, well, unfortunately we didn't go to court, but government has gotten the message that you cannot try and change the governing form of South Africa without massive pushback. Is, however, something that will be very valuable in the future. South Africa has several crises that we are facing. Government instituting a state of disaster for electricity means government can suddenly institute a state of disaster for water, and if they really want to stretch the legal limit for transport, saying there's lots of potholes and the existing legislative instruments don't deal with it adequately. And this created the risk of not being a democracy, but being a disasterocracy. So from our perspective, yes, we will take them back to court once again. The risk of a national blackout, we have several members at National Control who have confirmed this for us. It's national blackouts happen due to transmission failure, not due to generation failure. And the risk of a national blackout is as great at stage 8 as it is at stage 2. The load shedding that we are implementing is meant to mitigate this risk, which means it's a risk that usually happens due to natural disasters or sabotage. Obviously, if we're in a situation where people blow up a pylon and we're going to a total blackout, then we can have a talk about actually managing that situation as a state of disaster. But just the normal ongoing 16-year-long electricity crisis does not constitute a state of disaster, especially given the fact that government has every single tool they need to either solve it or allow the private and community sector to solve it already in their hands. They've had it in their hands for 5 years. Just because they're not using them doesn't mean they need new tools. It means they need to start using them. And if they can't, then fire the people who can't use it and get people who can.
We'll leave it there. Connie Mulder is the head of Solidarity's Research Institute, speaking to us about the termination with immediate effect of the national state of disaster and electricity supply constraints, and also saying that, you know, government was assisted in making this particular decision through the court action that they had instituted. And of course, they've been asked to withdraw that, which they have.